Hey, welcome to the Joy Sessions. This is Dr. Jennifer Jill Schwirzer, and I'm here to share with you some insights as to how we can all together cultivate more positive emotions. That's the name of my series, the Joy Sessions. I'm a psychotherapist and teacher of mental health and biblically grounded psychology, and I love that intersection between psychology and theology. So I'm going to be unpacking to you some lessons today about shame. The title of my talk is Such a Shame, and the subtitle is Processing the Most Intense Emotion Known to Mankind. It was shame that caused the death of Jesus. It was bearing our shame that caused the physical ramifications of that intense emotion that ultimately led to his death. I know a little about shame myself. I'm going to tell you a story from my teenage years. Here I am playing my guitar and being all meditative, but I wasn't always a calm and placid young lady. In fact, I accidentally burned a house down. So I'll tell you the story. My friend and I decided that we were very curious about smoking cigarettes, and we started to smoke cigarettes. And when you first start smoking cigarettes, the nicotine gives you a real rush. And so we were giggling and laughing, and we dropped the cigarette, and it went into the side of the couch we were sitting on, burned down into the box springs. Now, we went and got water, poured the water where the hole was, and sprayed Glade, forgetting it was flammable, and all of this. She went off to a family event, and I went home. I was sitting in that very place where you see me in this picture when my little brother burst into my room without knocking, which was a crime punishable by death practically in those days, but he was overwhelmed with the news that Jennifer Sue Cook's house is burning down. I jumped on my back and I rode like the wind as fast as my legs could carry me, and then I threw my bike down and ran the rest of the way. And when I got to the house, there was a mob gathered around that house, and it was going up in flames. It was a horrible moment of realization of what I had done and what it had led to. I ran to my friend. I wanted to be honest and tell everyone, but she looked at me and she said, "Don't tell anyone." And she was my best friend. So we tried to keep it a secret. It went for about a year. Her father, who happened to be a lawyer of all things, found a note that I had written that disclosed what had happened. And my punishment was telling my mother what I had done. Now, that was probably the worst day of my life. We were in a parking lot of a shopping center. It was a dreary, dismal day, and I can see it like it happened yesterday when I said, "Mom, do you remember the Cook's fire?" And her eyes began to flash in that way that a mother's eyes flash when she knows her kid is about to tell her something that they don't want to hear. She said, "Why?" And I said, "Because I was responsible for it, Mom." It was one of the hardest days of my life. And what made it doubly painful and difficult was that I had talked my mother out of smoking. She was a smoker, and I had talked her out of it because all this news was coming forth about the dangerous effect of smoking and cancer and all this. And so she quit at my behest. And then I went and smoked. And did she rub my face in that? Yeah, she did a little bit. I felt such overwhelming shame as a result of accidentally, but still, burning a house down. I know a thing or two about shame as a result of that. And that's not the only thing that's brought me shame. But I want to look now at the process of the fall of humanity. This is found in Genesis chapter 3. And I'm speaking now as a person who has studied the secular theories of psychology. There is no explanation of the human condition as concise and yet comprehensive as the one we find in one chapter in the Bible. Volumes have been written on the human condition and what makes us broken by all the great minds of secular psychology, but none of them have nailed it like God does in his word in Genesis chapter 3. Here are the steps that explain what is going on with humanity today on a psychological level. Number one, there was a disconnect between Adam and Eve. She began to dialogue with the serpent, and that disconnect weakened her to temptation. We need to be connected to one another and to God to be fortified against temptation. Then there was this misapprehension that occurred. The enemy insinuated that God was permissive and she could eat of any tree, but then she in a sort of a polarity and a polemic, said back, well, no, we can't even touch it. So by now she's confused as to what God actually did say. And when we misunderstand what someone says, we misunderstand their character. And so she's in pretty much full-blown misapprehension of God's character at this point. And she's also vulnerable to temptation because of that. And I think what happened is, as soon as she said, we can't even touch it, he put the fruit in her hands, and she thought, it's already too late. I might as well partake. And she partook of the fruit, and then she went to her husband. Now, we're told that he was not deceived, but he saw his beautiful Eve in front of him, and he said, I can't live without her. I would rather die with her. And so he partook. And then we're told in Genesis chapter 3 that the eyes of them both were opened, and they knew that they were naked. The scriptures use nakedness as an analogy of moral nakedness that we experience as a result of sin. And so they were standing in a state of moral nakedness at that point. You know, I used to have a recurring dream as a child. I would show up at school, take off my jacket, and all I had underneath my jacket was my underwear. And the weird thing about the dream was I couldn't do anything about it. I couldn't put my coat back on. I couldn't run home and get clothes. I couldn't do anything. I had to just stand there naked. That experience of being naked in front of people is terrifying, particularly to children. Now, we're in danger in our society of losing that natural sensitivity to physical nakedness through a lot of our practices, pornography, immodesty of various kinds. But humanity experiences moral nakedness on a regular basis, and that is what I'm calling shame. Well, this is such an overwhelming emotional experience that the first thing we'll do when something is overwhelming is we will deny the reality of it. That's what Adam and Eve did. They thought, okay, no problem, we can take care of this. And they made for themselves fig leaf garments, and those are symbolized by, those are symbols of self-righteousness. This is their attempt to generate merit, to cure or somehow solve the problem of the moral nakedness that has come upon them. And they make these fig leaf garments. And by the way, I have fig trees on my farm, and they are very scratchy. And they're very hairy kind of leaves, so they must have been quite uncomfortable. Well, we see that they did absolutely no good for Adam and Eve, because God came into the garden in the cool of the day, we're told, same day, and they hide behind the trees. They are terrified of the one that they used to welcome with open arms. Then they begin to blame each other when God calls them to account. Adam blames Eve, indirectly blames God. Eve blames the serpent, indirectly blames God. They're in full-blown, what they call stinking thinking in 12 steps. They're blaming one another. This is the blame game. Then there's this animosity you can see. Now, why did Adam blame his wife? Well, he thought God had come to execute the sentence of death. In the day you eat thereof, you will surely die. At least this is my belief. He thought he was about to die. So in a last-ditch effort to save his own hide, he says, the woman, where's all the love now, Adam? Just earlier in the same day, hours ago, you made a choice to die with her rather than live without her. And now you're willing for her to die in your place. So where's all the love in human nature? No, replacing that love is animosity between human beings. And then there's a certain despair, because now sin has affected all of creation, not only their nature, but the nature around them. This is the most comprehensive yet concise explanation of human nature, the human condition, that I have seen anywhere. And I want to focus in on shame. The eyes of them both were opened, we're told, and they knew that they were naked. Here are a couple of experts who have studied shame, commenting on it. Joseph Burgos says, coping with shame is a daily preoccupation. Not shame in the big toxic sense, but in a kind of everyday way. In other words, we experience shame, and it sort of weaves its way into our human experience, and it's kind of pervasive. And then Gershon Kaufman said, shame is the most disturbing experience individuals ever have about themselves. No other emotion feels more deeply disturbing, because in the moment of shame, the self feels wounded from within. So experts that study human psychology understand the pervasiveness and the intensity of shame. Now, what has happened to human nature as a result of this shame that came upon us is we have developed certain coping mechanisms. And something I've noticed in my clinical practice is that people will often compensate for shame through narcissistic behaviors. They will try to build up a sense of pride. Or some people kind of go to the other extreme where they have like chronic low self-worth. Really, those are both working off the same foundation of trying to compensate for this moral injury, this shame injury that came upon human nature. Shame creates a worthiness vacuum. You see, we no longer innately feel worthy. If there's something I hear constantly from people who are struggling with negative emotions is, I don't feel worthy. I don't feel worthy of love. I don't feel worthy of God loving me. I have a sense of unworthiness. Or some people on the other end of the extreme feel entitled. They build up a sense of entitlement that really kind of becomes entitlement mentality. So there are two ditches we can fall into there. And oftentimes we go from one ditch to the other, back and forth, kind of haphazardly. So what we need is a restoration of our sense of moral rectitude. We need merit. We need merit in order to stand before a holy God. And of course, that merit is found in Jesus. But I want to talk about one of the barriers to receiving the merits of Jesus, to learning how to rest in his righteousness. And that's something I call licensing effect. Licensing effect has been well studied in research. I'm about to share with you a number of different studies that have been done. And it is the belief that past good deeds can liberate individuals to engage in behaviors that are immoral, unethical, or otherwise problematic. That's licensing effect. Oh, if I do this, then that means this good thing. That means I can do this naughty thing. Don't we operate that way? Aren't there entire religious institutions that are built on the foundation of licensing effect and work off of checks and balances, moral checks and balances, where we get permission to sin by engaging in good deeds? You recognize this. I recognize this. It's part of our nature as the result of the fall. I want to show you a study. This is a population study where a cross-section of the population was looked at carefully in regards to licensing effect. So in this study, individuals who endorsed Barack Obama during the 2008 presidential election were more likely to express racist views in other contexts. It's kind of like I gave it the office, you know. I voted for him, now I can be a racist jerk in other contexts. That's how licensing effect works. It's pretty ugly. So let me mention some experimental design studies. Now, something that's fascinating about experimental studies, we often say, referring to population research, that correlation does not equal causality. But actually, in experimental design studies, you can remove and then re-add variables. You can't do that with population research. But when you remove and re-add variables, you can see the effect of something more clearly. And so often experimental research will hint at least strongly hint at causality, things that are caused by certain things. So what we think is that with this licensing effect, there is definitely a cause and effect phenomena. So in this study, individuals imagined doing community service. They didn't actually do it, but they imagined doing community service, and then they were given money to purchase one of two things, either designer jeans or something utilitarian like a vacuum cleaner. And the individuals who had imagined doing community service were more likely to buy the extravagant item. Another study, these individuals imagined donating money to, they didn't actually do it, they just imagined donating money to charity. And then they were given a choice as to whether to buy utilitarian sunglasses, the kind that I buy. They're like $5 because I lose them all the time. Or luxury sunglasses. And the people who had imagined donating money to charity bought the expensive, extravagant sunglasses. They indulged themselves, in other words. They thought that they were meritorious, and so I can afford a little indulgence here. In another study, individuals signed up to help a foreign student and then were given money to donate to charity, and it was found that those that signed up to help a foreign student gave less money to charity. And then finally, this is the most, I think, important of these studies. Individuals were given money and told to do two things: buy cleaning products and then also donate some money to charity. Give some money away and also buy cleaning products. And they were given a choice between conventional cleaning products and green cleaning products. Now, I believe in preserving the environment. I'm all about that. And so it's great to buy green products. But what the researchers found is that those that bought the conventional products actually gave more money away. So you can see over and over again, this licensing effect has been replicated in research. Here's one of the authors speaking about it. She says, licensing effect might be at work. When we engage in a good deed, that gives us a kind of satisfaction. And then she says, with that self-satisfied feeling can come tacit permission to behave more selfishly. You know, shame is pervasive. Our way of coping with it is to try to generate our own merit. You've just seen examples of that. But I would like to propose to you that what God does for the shame problem is much different than what we do. He, so to speak, to quote someone some of you may not like, and some of you may, he drains the swamp. He drains the water, brings the water table of shame down. He drains away the fundamental moral shame that afflicts humanity. I live on a farm in Florida. Florida's one big swamp. The soil is sand. And so what happens is these reservoir areas will fill up with water during the rainy season and then drain away during the dry season. Well, one year during the rainy season, our field got completely flooded. It had never happened before. I mean, it was really weird. Like there was so much rain that the water table just rose and rose and rose and finally broke the surface, and the whole field became a swamp or a lake, and there were water birds coming in. It was really kind of creepy. This is how shame works. There's a water table of shame in human nature as a result of the fall. We have this profound moral injury that we live with day after day. And it sometimes breaks the surface in various forms. But as God leads us to through his cross, drain away that moral shame, that water table of shame, we're not going to experience as much of these ancillary types of shame. So some of those ancillary types are like body shame, where we're ashamed of how we look. Behavioral shame, where we're ashamed of things we do. Mind shame, where we're ashamed of our intellectual capacity. Material shame, where we feel poor or less materially wealthy in contrast to someone else. Religious shame, where we feel condemned religiously. And collective shame, where we feel shame because of someone from our people group, what someone from our people group has done. And then social shame, a sense of being just not loved socially and awkward socially. All of these are sort of ways in which shame can bubble to the surface. But what God proposes to do through the cross of Jesus and through the righteousness of Christ is drain away that water table. I want to take a moment here to contrast guilt and shame. They are related, but not the same thing. Guilt says, I did wrong. Shame says, I am wrong. Guilt is rather realistic about our sinfulness, and it says, okay, sinners sin. But shame often results in a feeling of sin is unique to me. Guilt says, I fail sometimes. It's reality. Shame says, if I fail, I'm a failure. Shame always personalizes things. Guilt says, there is forgiveness. Shame says, this is permanent. Guilt says, this is about them. In other words, I have hurt people, and I want to make that right. But shame tends to be narcissistic and turn it back to self. Oh, I have failed, and it's all about me. Guilt says, how did you feel? And shame says, how do I feel? So you can see that guilt is, in many ways, a better way to handle sin in our lives. Shame drives blame. I'm going to be more inclined to want to blame other people if I'm experiencing shame, because how can I take responsibility if I'm incapable of doing anything right? So I want to share with you some research that kind of makes this situation a little bit more complicated, but then I'm going to try to resolve it before I bow out. This is some research done on inmates. And the researchers came to this conclusion. They said guilt proneness involves a working model of self that is humble about personal limitations. Shame proneness involves a more narcissistic model of self. So it seems that when we tend to process our sin by feeling guilty, we're more healthy overall. When we tend to process our sin by feeling ashamed, we're probably dealing with a higher level of narcissism or self-centeredness. Shame predicts things like low self-esteem, hostility, social anxiety, depression, eating disorders, and body dysmorphia. The Bible seems to resound with this aversion to shame. We read in Psalm 25, "In you, Lord my God, I put my trust. I trust in you. Do not let me be put to shame, nor let my enemies triumph over me. No one who hopes in you will ever be put to shame, but shame will come on those who are transgressors without cause." Treacherous, without cause. So I want to put a little wrench in the works because I've been making a case for how guilt is the appropriate way to process and shame is the inappropriate way. I want to put a wrench in the works because I think shame does have a place. We are wrong. We're fallen and sinful by nature. And if we completely disallow feelings of shame, we can create secondary disturbance where people feel ashamed of feeling ashamed. So I think it's okay to normalize shame to a degree. So I want to share another study with you. This is a study of 476 inmates. And those that were shame-prone were more likely to reoffend. And the inmates that were shame-prone were also more likely to blame. But they did find a group of inmates that were shame-prone who did not blame other people. And those were no less likely to reoffend than the guilt-prone inmates. The researchers said the possibility that shame could be harnessed for social good is tantalizing. So what do we do with shame? We want to sort of drain out that water table, don't we? You know, often shame leads us into addiction cycles. We feel that shame, and then often what people do is they turn to the very sin that caused the shame in order to sort of medicate themselves against that disturbing experience of feeling ashamed. And that can lead to addictive behaviors, which can be very damaging and painful, and then there's more shame, and there's more sin, and the cycle goes round and round and round. How do we break this cycle? I propose to you that God puts before us this beautiful replacement for guilt and shame in the form of repentance. And I want to read this from Romans chapter 2, verses 4 to 6. "Do you despise the riches of his goodness, forbearance, and long-suffering, not knowing that the goodness of God leads you to repentance?" Repentance isn't about heaping shame on people. It's about healing them through the goodness of God. "But in accordance with your hardness and your impenitent heart, you are treasuring up for yourself wrath in the day of wrath and revelation of the righteous judgment of God, who will render to each according to his deeds." Our God is a God of justice, but fortunately he's made a way of escape whereby we can alleviate our shame and our guilt before him. And that way is repentance. We're told in 2 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul is describing here the wonderful repentance that the Corinthian church experienced after something that he had confronted them for in 1 Corinthians. And he says this about their exemplary repentance. He says, "You sorrowed in a godly manner. What diligence it produced in you. What clearing of yourselves. What indignation. What fear. What vehement desire. What zeal. What vindication. In all things you proved yourselves to be clear in this matter." So let's look at these things. A lot of fancy language here. That diligence means intentionality. People in repentance will be very intentional about repairing the damage that was done. Clearing means complete confession. Don't hold anything back. Confess everything to God and confess appropriately to the people that you have harmed. Don't blame them. Take the responsibility. Indignation is an abhorrence of sin, even of the sin we commit. Fear is an appropriate fear of God. A vehement desire is a passion for restitution. Zeal is an intense purpose of making right the wrong. And the vindication is the vindication of the innocent. It is not their fault. I take responsibility for this. That is what true repentance looks like. And God, through his goodness, can give us that gift. So my assignment for you is to lay all of your shame. This is your takeaway. This is your action step. Lay all your shame at Jesus' feet. He wants to drain the water table of shame in your experience so that you can stand before him clear and clean. There will be times when you sin and you experience guilt and maybe even shame again. Continue. It's not about the product of guilt and shame, but about the process. What do you do with it? Continue throughout the rest of your life to lay that shame down at Jesus' feet, and he will heal you. Just want to share a poem that I wrote with you. It's called, and don't be shocked, Shame on You, Jesus. Sometimes expressions hold half-hidden truth, like a rare orchid deep in the forest, like the lack that we show when we say shame on you, when those words make the shamer the poorest. But that shame was indeed placed on one of great store, who bore all of our sin to reclaim us, and receiving his gift, while it proves us as poor, tells of mercy that rendered us blameless. Shame on you, Jesus. Shame on you. Shame on the one to whom no shame was due. Shame you despised and then took to the tree, where the shame was on you and the grace was on me. Sometimes we try to diminish the curse, that essential foundational scandal. We try putting it off on someone even worse, or think shrinking it down we can handle. But our shame can't be shrunk. It's too glaring to hide, and we don't have the power to throw it. So it must be released to the one crucified in a way that deep down we can know it. Shame on you, Jesus. Shame on you. Shame on the one to whom no shame was due. Shame you despised and then took to the tree, where the shame was on you and the grace was on me. We will never exhaust it, this theme of the love that placed infinite love in the worst place. And then in return, all he asks is the shame that put him on the cross in the first place. Shame on you, Jesus. Shame on you. Shame on the one to whom no shame was due. Shame you despised, but then took to the tree, where the shame was on you and the grace was on me.